Hi, welcome back to the CQI sessions hosted here at UC Davis Extension Center for Human Services. I'm Jennifer Haight from Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago and the Center for State Child Welfare Data housed at Chapin Hall. And my colleague Daniel Webster from the Child Welfare Indicators Project at Berkeley and I are here today to talk to you about duration. So don't worry, we won't take too long to talk about duration. So this session today is called Mod 4, Measuring Duration, and we want to continue working with some of the ideas we introduced in the previous session about the principles of good measurement and their connection to CQI. As a reminder, when we talk about CQI, we're talking about continuous quality improvement. So today we're going to return to some of the things we talked about last time and sort of focus more specifically on good measurement habits, and particularly good measurement habits that relate to duration. Because one of the things that we talk about a lot and care about a lot when we think about the experience of children in foster care is how long they are removed from their home and in a temporary setting. So it's an important question. One of the things we talked about quite a bit, either in sessions you've seen with Daniel and me in person, or whether you paid really close attention to the last session, which I'm sure you did, is the importance of asking good, solid analytic questions. Because when you ask a good, solid analytic question, it sets you up to continue to manifest what we think are the best habits in measurement practice. And one of the next best habits is to make sure you select the appropriate denominator or risk set, or the appropriate group of children or youth or whomever for whom your question has relevance. And usually, we have a little hint here, usually it's an entry cohort. And the final thing, as you are continuing your practice of good measurement habits, the final thing you have to do in structuring your good question and selecting your appropriate denominator is to select the appropriate statistic to answer the question. So all of those things are going to be sort of in the background of our conversation today about duration, measuring duration in a child welfare system. So the key question for stakeholders when they're encountering a situation when a child or group of children has been removed from their biological parent or parents and placed in state custody and placed in a temporary setting, the key questions stakeholders want to know are, what will her exit destination be when this child who's been removed from her parents returns somewhere? Where will that be? And how long will she be in foster care? How long will it take? Sorry. So this figure, I just want to, since I said earlier we're focusing on duration, I don't want to ignore the other question, where do children go? But I want to sort of answer it quickly and then move on to duration, because one of the key things to realize when you're thinking about those two questions is though they relate to the same child and they relate to the same situation, they're very different questions. And one of the things we're trying to do as we try and build good measurement habits and build robust CQI efforts in child welfare agencies is to be really clear about how those two questions are different and how they should be answered with different techniques. So to dispatch with this first important question, where do children go when they exit foster care? I've put this image in the PowerPoint that's figure 3 from what we call the profile reports available on the Center for State Child Welfare Data website. And this particular figure is for the state of California for a group of children who entered care from 2005 through 2008, about that. And it shows what their final exit destination was based on their age at entry. And you can look more closely at this graph in your workbook, but generally speaking, what it depicts of children of almost any age, the most likely exit destination is a permanent home. The top gray line, which is by far the most likely destination for almost every child until you get to the teens, is a return to family. So children who enter foster care are most likely to return to a family member. The second most likely destination is represented by the darker black line with the sort of squares denoting the age groups, and that is exit to adoption. So this shows that many infants exit to adoption. If they don't exit, return to their family. And the likelihood of adoption goes down as you get older. But nevertheless, between adoption, reunification, and exit to relative, which includes guardianship, this figure shows the answer to that very important question, where do children go? And it suggests that most children exit to permanency. So this is not to say that we can't think about that destination question more carefully or more specifically for different groups of children, but it's to deal with it separately and to suggest that when you talk about the experience of children in foster care, you can think about where they go as one important question and how long it takes as a second one. So as figure 3 shows, most children will return to permanency. So that brings us to our next question. Well, then how long will it take? And that's a very important question. We want to know how long children who have already had the trauma of having been removed from their parents and their communities and their homes, how long will they be in a temporary setting until they return to that permanent home? As we've seen, most of them are going to return there. So that is the question that we're going to focus on for the rest of this module. How do we measure duration so that we can effectively answer the questions stakeholders are asking when you take a child from his or her home? How long is it until they return to a permanent setting? So just as a reminder, we talk a lot in Mod 3 about representative samples, denominators, risk sets, and the things you have to do to make sure that you're picking a representative sample. And this image is just a reminder of that conversation. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over it, but I will remind you that the image represents children in care, and those horizontal lines there's one horizontal line for each child. The length of the line connects to the number of days that child has spent in care. So the blue lines are children who have longer durations. The red lines are children who have shorter durations. The yellow box is our administrative database. So that's what we have available to help us answer questions. The black line represents a point-in-time sample. And so what this figure reminds you of is that when you select a point-in-time sample to answer a question about what's the typical duration for children, for example, in out-of-home care, that black line intersects with far more blue lines than red lines, and it oversamples on long stayers. So this is just a reminder that in your effort to select a representative sample, when you're measuring duration, if you select a point-in-time sample, which there is often an inclination to do that, you're going to report the wrong statistic. Well, you're going to report the wrong information. You're going to report to your stakeholders that children spend longer in care than is typical. So this is just a reminder that you need to pay attention to your sample. And when you want to ask what is typical and you're trying to pick a representative sample, we almost always select the entry cohort because the point-in-time sample biases towards overstating long stayers. And if you choose an exit sample, which would be represented on the left side of the line, those with the bars that end before January 1, 2011, in this case, you are picking one red to one blue, a second red, a second blue. So you have half the kids are longer stayers, half the kids are shorter stayers. That may be true, it may not be true. It's only true if the kids exiting care are identical to the sample of kids entering care over time, year over year over year. Since what we're trying to do in the systems we're working in is generate change, innovate, improve outcomes, to assume that the exiters represent the group of kids entering is to make a very unwise assumption about something that's really important. You're assuming that the kids exiting care in any given year are very similar to the kids who enter care in any given year, and therefore their experience is a reasonable approximation of the experience of the entries. I could talk a lot about why that's not true, but I'm going to just ask you to trust me on this. And when you want to measure the experience of children in your system, specifically when you want to measure duration, choose a representative sample, and that sample is an entry cohort. So we're going to spend a couple of minutes talking about what an entry cohort looks like from this duration perspective, and then we're going to move on to talk about the correct statistic and the tools that are available to you to generate that statistic. One of the things that is true of entrance, or those admissions, children in an admission cohort, which is different from the point in time cohort or from the exit cohort, is that you don't know the final exit for everyone who's entered until you've observed them all leave care. So you don't know their total duration. So rather than get undone by this sort of fact that some kids who enter stay longer than some kids who don't enter, what you do is you choose a statistic that handles that in a measurement savvy way. So when we talk about duration, we're going to select the entry cohort. We're going to acknowledge that the entry cohort has children in care, some of whom have exited and some have not yet exited, and we're going to use a measurement statistic that helps us manage that situation. So this is an image here that many of you who've been to our courses have seen before. It's a selection of records from a county in the Foster Care Data Archive, which is housed at the Center for State Child Welfare Data. And it is an image that represents a small county where about 90 children entered care over the course of the 2006 calendar year. Like the other image, but a little bit smaller, each line represents a child. And the lines are organized by when the child entered care. So you can see from the bottom, the first child entered care early in January, and the length of the line also corresponds to how many days they were in care. So some of the kids who entered in January exited in the same year that they entered. If you go up to about the 21st or 22nd young person, you'll see that they entered in January, but they were in care for much longer. In fact, they were in care out till 2010, the mid part of 2010. And as you continue to look up this graph, you'll see that children enter care over the course of the year, and if you work in systems, you know that's true. Every day, you're just as likely to have another entry as you are a previous day, all things being equal. And that there's no guarantee that short stayers come in the early part of the year and long stayers come in the middle and really long stayers come in the end. This graphic shows that children come in at different times in the year, and each child is just as likely as another to have a varying duration in care. So that's what it looks like when you look at them from how they flow in. The next image just sort of rearranges them. And we're going to come back to this because there's some tricky things here. So it's just important to sort of expose yourself to these concepts and hope that one of the ways I explain it actually is going to make some sense. So this is the same group of kids, the same group of entry cohorts, everyone who entered in 2006. But now along the x-axis, instead of seeing calendar time, we're looking at duration. So we're basically denoting for these lines how many days they represent. And so to make it easier to sort of absorb the variation in duration, we've stacked them now not by calendar time, but by length of time. So the bottom records are those children who had the longest durations, and the top, the 86th or 87th kid, is the one who had the shortest duration. So it has this sort of sloping triangle shape. And you'll see at the very bottom there are two red bars. We're going to get back to this in a minute. Those two red bars represent those two children who came in 2006, who by the time our data period had ended, which I think was in 2012, they were still in care. So we don't know entirely how long they spent in care, but we do know they were there from some point of calendar year 2006 up until the end of the sample. So they are our longest stayers. Everyone else who's a black line represent a child who's exited. So you can see they're stacked in duration order, and that yellow line in the middle represents the halfway point. So we're going to come back to that too, but just understand that the way this is stacked, it says all the kids above the yellow line, those are half the kids who had relatively short stays. Of the children below the yellow line, those are the half of the kids who had longer stays. So this is a very efficient and sort of easy to understand image that takes that first image that looks something like this and puts it in duration order. and provides you some information about that how long question. How long do children who enter care stay in care? So I want to return to the previous image because what we've done here is we have the same group of kids, the same group of kids who entered in January 2006, now reordered to show when they entered care and how long they stayed, not ordered by how long they stayed. And we changed the color of some of the bars to indicate those children who exited to reunification. So it's just another way you can annotate this information that provides you with something other than duration detail. It says those kids with those blue bars are children who exited to reunification. The next slide continues with this adding color to our images and adds green. So the green bars are those bars associated with children who entered care and exited to adoption. So now, when we resort the bars, if you look, well, before we resort the bars, if you take a look at that, you'll see that the green bars are a little bit longer than the blue bars on average. The blue bars are a lot more of those shorter ones. So this sort of reinforces something that we know, that those kids who are going to enter care and reunify, they tend to do that a little bit faster than those children who are going to exit to adoption, because adoption is a process that takes longer. So that's some interesting information that modifies the way we can interpret these records. Now when we resort these tables again, unfortunately the color coding isn't available for this second slide, but this is just resorting them, and now you have even more appreciation for the experience of this group of children who entered in 2006. What these images are leading us to is the statistic I referred to before, or the measurement choice that best summarizes duration for groups of kids entering care using all of the information we know about the children in an entry cohort up until the end of the data collection period. So this is a very robust and rich way to measure duration. And it's also, once you get used to looking at images in this way, it provides you with a great deal of information. So when we go back to the restacked slide of those 86 children who entered in 2006, and we now see them stacked again based on how long they were in care rather than when they came into care, you can get the beginning of a sense of speed and how long it took for these group of kids who entered care 5 years ago to exit care. We know, based on the previous two slides, that most of them went either to reunification, the blue bars, or to adoption, the green bars. And we have a sense, basically, of how long it took. So that middle bar, the yellow one that's labeled the median, which represents the point at which half of the children exited, if you draw a line down from that median, you get to about, say, 250 days. And that answers an important question. It answers the question, how long did it take for half of the kids who entered care in 2006 to exit? And the answer is less than a year, a little bit more than 6 months. The statistic that helps us summarize this information and allows us to answer the question of duration for one or more entry cohorts is called a survival curve. And we're going to turn to Daniel, my colleague, to get a definition of what a survival curve is and to talk about how you can use that information to speak effectively and correctly about the experience of children who are removed from their homes and placed in foster care, and answer that question, how long does it take until they achieve permanency?
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm Daniel Webster. I'm the project director of the California Child Welfare Indicators Project at the School of Social Welfare at UC Berkeley. And as Jennifer was saying, I'm going to talk about survival curves and survival analysis as a statistical means to look at duration to an outcome of interest. I mean, Jennifer spent some time talking about some of the pitfalls of looking at data in ways that lead to biased estimations of, for example, duration in care. So we're going to talk about survival analysis, which is a class of statistics that generates more reliable estimates of things like time in foster care. So in child welfare, our event of interest, as Jennifer was talking about earlier, is the duration in foster care. And if the term seems a little counterintuitive for child welfare workers. That's with good reasons. It's a term that was adopted from biomedical field where they examine questions such as time of surviving after getting a severe illness or undergoing an invasive procedure or something along those lines. For our purposes today, for these examples, we'll be talking about duration, surviving, remaining in foster care. And one of the most helpful means of describing the shape of a survival curve is the median or the midpoint, which is the 50th percentile on the curve. So let's take a look at some of the basics of a survival curve, and in a moment we'll take an opportunity and visit both the QUIP and State Data Center websites where we can see some of the resources that are available for these statistical survival analysis estimates on both those websites. So this is an example from the State Data Center of some survival curves that were generated from actual data from a jurisdiction, from California in fact. And the curve shows us on both the duration of time in care, that's along the x-axis. In this case, it's denoted in days, and also the likelihood of experiencing an event, which is on the y-axis, and that would be, in this case, the proportion of children experiencing the event of interest, which is exiting from foster care. And each of the curves represents a different group or cohort of children that are entering foster care and remaining in foster care. And as the curves over time, as the curves drop, that shows the proportions of children that are remaining in care. So for example, at the far left on the x-axis, there's a 0. That's days passed since entering foster care. And so at the 0 days of past entering foster care, 100% on the y-axis, 100% of those children remain in care. And then as you move to the right along the x-axis, as time passes, then the proportion remaining in foster care will decline. And that is what you see with the curves as they are dropping. And so the faster that a curve drops means that that group of children is experiencing the outcome of interest faster than, say, a curve that doesn't drop as steeply. So on this survival curve, we have got 3 lines. These are for different cohorts of children entering foster care in California. And you'll notice that the lines are not equally the same length, and that is because we have different amount of follow-up time available for each of these different groups. For example, the shortest line, the top line, is for a group of children who entered foster care in California in calendar year 2012. The data that are used to generate this curve go through about the midpoint of 2013. So for that group, we have roughly, for a child entering on the first day of 2012, we have roughly 18 months of follow-up time to track that child. So that's roughly a little less than 600 days. And so for children entering in earlier cohorts, such as 2009 and 2006, it stands to reason that we have longer time to track those kids, and so you'll see that those lines for those respective cohorts are longer. And so we mentioned the median before, and that is the point on the curve at which, as Jennifer was mentioning earlier, the point at which half the children in your cohort have exited. And on the curve here for the different lines at 50, you can see that the yellow line has not even reached the 50th percentile. So at the study cutoff, we had not yet observed, enough time had not yet elapsed for us to observe the point at which half of the children from 2012 had exited care. But for the other 2 cohorts entering in 2009 and 2012, we can see they cross the 50th percentile somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 days. And actually, let's go to the next slide, which talks about quartiles. And these are very useful means for describing the features, the shape of a survival curve. The 25th quartile, the first quartile, is the point at which 1/4 of the children in that cohort have exited care. And these quartiles that are on the slide at the moment show the numbers corresponding with the curves that we were just looking at. So for the 2006 cohort, we see that the first quartile exited a little over 100 days. For 2009, it was about 110 days, and for 2012, the 25th, the first quartile of kids exited about 176 days. So for the more recent group of entries, they are exiting care more slowly. It's taking them longer. It took a longer time for 1/4 of that cohort of 2012 kids to leave care. It took longer for them than it did for their counterparts in either the 2009 or 2006 cohorts. We can see here also on this quartile summary that for both the 2006 and the 2009 cohorts of children, they exited in the case of 2006 in roughly 400 days, a little bit less, and in 2009, 350 or some odd days. So a little bit shorter amount of time for that group. And then we also, enough time has elapsed for those earlier two cohorts that we can observe the point at which 3/4 of that group has exited care. And in the case of the 2006 cohort, it was over 700 days. And for the 2009 cohort, it was a little bit less than 700, 674 or so days. So this next slide, these following images show us how we can use some information about a cohort to talk about duration, even when a lot of the information is censored, as Jennifer was saying, at the point at which our data follow-up ends. Those children are remaining in care, and so we don't know how much longer they will remain in care. It could be another day after our study cutoff, or it could be another year. We don't know, but those events are censored at our study cutoff. But we can still tell a lot about duration, even when, in this case, these are the same data where the censored observations have been highlighted in red, and we can still tell a lot about the duration for that group, even though we haven't observed fully all the children, the time to exit for all the children. This is reminiscent of some of the slides that Jennifer talked about earlier, where it's looking at a cohort of children who entered, in this case, in 2007, and each line represents a child, and the length of the line represents how long that child was in care, and it's sorted in this case from the left on the day that the child entered care in 2007, and the length of the line shows you how long they remained in care. And then as you go up vertically on this graph, you can see when children came in at different points across 2007 and remained in care for different periods of time. This next graph sorts that same information by the length of time. So this is those same 51 observations, but now instead of being sorted from the day that they entered care in 2007, this is sorting them by the length of time that they remained in care. And we can see that the median is the point at which half of that group have exited care. And all of the red lines, in fact, are well beyond the middle point. And so we can actually talk about this group of kids who entered in 2007. We tracked them to the midpoint or so of 2009. But even though we haven't observed a chunk of the children, the exit time it took for them, we can still describe the midpoint at which that group of kids exited care. You can describe the median for a cohort of children as long as you have observed half the children's exits, and as long as you do not have a censored observation that is less than the median of the observed exits that you have for that group. So in this case, for example, quite conveniently, none of the censored observations fall prior to the median. And if you can imagine, let's say one of those black bars above the yellow bar there, which is the median, if one of them had been censored and over time that child exited at a time longer than the yellow bar, well then you would have to resort the bars in terms of length of time, and then that would change the median. But in this case, all of the censored observations fall after the yellow bar or the median, and so we can describe the middle point at which this group of kids, the amount of time it took for them to exit care. So now let's take a moment and go to both the State Data Center and Child Welfare Indicators Project's websites to look at some of the resources there that show us duration in care, which use the statistical analysis, the event history or survival curve analysis techniques. So let's take a moment and look at the resources on the QUIP and Chapin Hall State Data Center websites, where we can see the resources that are available to look at estimates that have been made based on survival analysis. So from the QUIP homepage, select measures, and a list of available measures will come up, and then under foster care, and there are a number of ways to get to this, but under foster care you can click median length of stay, and then these static pages enable you to select certain features to generate some of those quartile estimates that we were looking at together a moment ago. Can be available. So let's select a year, 2006, and generate the table. And what you can see is that what this analysis does is it creates a table that gives you the quartile estimates, which are where the median, the midpoint of time in care is highlighted in yellow, and here it's about 400 days or so statewide for this cohort, and the 25% of this cohort overall had left by 178 days, and then 75%, three-quarters of them had left much longer after that. But a key thing to keep in mind is that while we're talking about these, that there are better ways this is one of the better ways to look at duration in care for children, you need to keep in mind that this is the beginning of your questioning of practices and other continuous quality improvement efforts that you may want to implement based on the data that you see reflected in these measures, which again are the soundest ways to look at duration, for example, but then they should help you to prompt questions about what kinds of practice or programmatic or policy changes might be applicable in your county to affect change. So for example, in this table, it's stratified by kin and non-kin care because there's a very large difference with respect to both duration and programmatic concerns that one would have for children placed with relative versus non-relatives. And we can see that children placed in relatives, half of them leave care. It takes longer for half of them to leave care than children placed in non-relative care. And there are other ways that the data can be stratified on the QUIP website. If you stratify and look at the quartiles by age, you can see that children entering care as infants tend to stay longer, 538 days for half of them to leave for this cohort versus children, actually this is children who entered care as neonates. This is less than 1 month. So the infants have actually been stratified here into less than 1 month and 1 to 11 months. So, and you can see very large differences even within children less than a year old when they enter care. They're the children who enter care as neonates tend to stay the longest. And that we know, well, these are the children most likely to be adopted, so that is partially an explanation for why we might be observing these long lengths of stay, but we have to examine our own county or jurisdiction practice to see what else may be going on that might explain, for example, some of these other durations in care that we observe in the table. So the QUIP site, as I was saying, gives you some static means to look at different strata. You can look at different entry cohorts and see how duration in care has been changing over time. But let's go and look at the Chapin Hall State Child Welfare Data Center and look at the resources that are available there and generate some survival curves, much like those that we were looking at together in the previous slides. So from the home page, you'll need to log in, which I will do. And from this page, I'll select the multi-state website, since this contains data both from California, my home state, as well as enables you to make comparisons with jurisdictions from around the country. Then select all spells. We'll leave all counties as the default selection. We'll look at first entries to care, children who have not been in the child welfare system before. Let's go ahead and select one of the cohorts that we were looking at on the survival curve graph that we talked about earlier, and let's look at 2006. And we will look at length of stay, and we'll build our report, and then we're asked to make a comparison. And so let's go ahead and make a population comparison. And for our group to compare, to make a population comparison, we will look at both genders, all ethnicities. We'll go ahead and let's take a look at the babies. So entering care as infants, that is less than 1 year old. We'll look at first admissions to care again, and then we'll select the same cohort, January 1, 2006 to December 31st of 2006, and then we'll give it a population nickname. We'll call this California Infant Entries for 2006. And then let's generate a survival curve. This is the, you can see the quartile estimates here for the base population, which was all entries in California for the given year, and the median time in care is around 400 days. And it's, as we saw on the other table from the Berkeley site, that the children entering as infants stay for a longer period of time than other age groups. And the curves that are generated, you can see again that the line dropping more steeply represents, this is the entire cohort of children entering care in this year, and you see that line is dropping more steeply, and so those children are exiting foster care more quickly than the other line, which represents California infants. And so if we were to look at the median time, the time at which half the respective cohorts have left care, and you compare this point, which is reflected in the table as 391 days, right? If you were to drop this from this point straight down, it'd be right close to 400. And then carrying over forward to where the infant line is, we see that that is closer to 500 days along the x-axis. And so the difference between these two lines is showing us both how fast the children are, these proportions of these different groups of kids are exiting foster care. And there can be very good programmatic factors or there could be different programmatic factors that are influencing these lengths of stay. We know that infants, as I was mentioning earlier, tend to be adopted, more likely to be adopted than older kids. And actually we see then, as we go out along the x-axis in terms of time, that the lines cross, and at a certain point in time, after about, I want to say this is probably 3 years, so roughly the time after which adoptions will, for many children, will be taking place. We see that the infant line has crossed the other line, and these children exit much more quickly than children of older age groups who are staying in care longer, and that's why the line is higher. These are a couple of resources, both the QUIP site and the State Data Center site. We can also, on the State Data Center site, if we wish to, we can download this information to a PDF. We can make changes to the population that we're observing, or we may wish to add a comparison group into the population. That could be another jurisdiction if we wanted to see how one of our neighboring counties or jurisdictions is doing with respect to their durations in care as we examine questions programmatically or policy-wise, and we want to share ideas that for best practice or our CQI efforts. And this is one tool that would enable us to tease apart different effects both by age or by geography. The data center tool enables us to add other comparison groups into our survival analysis populations in reference to the other populations that we've already generated. So let's go ahead. We've looked at all entries for this entry cohort year. We've looked and seen the difference of time in care for babies. Let's take a look and see how the duration in care might be different for children who are entering care as teenagers. So I'll change the minimum and max, min and max start ages for those kids. I'll keep it with the same. I'll keep it at first entries to care and the same entry cohort year, and then I'll just call this California. We'll call this California teens. Teen entries, 2006, and let's plot that. Here's the report that's generated, and we have our quartile estimates that were given, and the teens in this case are the yellow line, and we're seeing that for those teens entering care, they are initially exiting much more quickly than both the entry cohort overall and the infant. So there's obviously qualitatively a much different experience for these children who are entering care as adolescents, and of course obviously there are programmatic concerns that are much different for these older children entering care. And certainly as we move forward, this cohort that we're looking at together here is for an earlier cohort, 2006, and certainly what moving forward for our programmatic CQI efforts, this is the kind of population that we would want to be observing how their duration in care will be changing over time with the implementation of certain policies such as Assembly Bill 12 for non-minor dependents, children remaining who are able now to remain longer in foster care. And so for teens entering care in later cohorts than what we're observing here, we're probably going to observe their length of stay changing to longer than we are seeing here for this particular graph. But by having the flexibility with this tool to look at different groups, either in this case based on age at entry to care, or in some jurisdictions they may wish to focus on populations of children that stratified by different ethnic groups, and use the different outputs, the different time in care estimates and survival curves that they can see for those different groups, and use that to monitor the issues of importance that may need targeting for practice changes in their county. But that is the kind of ongoing review of the data that's necessary in a CQI process, is that it's not a one-time event where you look at, in this case, duration and then think that you know the whole story. It's an iterative process where you're examining the data isolating the groups of interest, determining what your programmatic or policy changes that you need to, may or may not need to implement to affect change for that group, and then returning to the data and monitoring it over time to see if your programmatic or policy efforts have made an impact in the direction that you are anticipating and hoping for.
We're back. We just spent some time reviewing a module that focuses on duration and some important best measurement principles that we'd like you to understand when it comes to measuring duration. And when we say that, we mean, of course, how long does it take for a child who enters foster care? How long does it take before they exit? So, Daniel and I are here today because over the course of time, we have taught these principles a number of times to a lot of participants, and there's always sort of a struggle around this way of thinking about duration because it's quite different. And we thought maybe if we developed an exercise that was more hands-on, that allowed folks to actually physically work with data, they might be able to get a better sense of some of the important ways that one should measure duration, and then how that they can use the information to support their CQI process.
Yeah, these are very abstract concepts, and so we felt that by creating this more concrete way for folks to physically manipulate some of these elements, that might help to reinforce the concepts more strongly for them.
Yeah.
So we developed this board, which should look reminiscent of some of the slides that the folks will have seen earlier in the module. Mm-hmm. And so the board represents, in this case, calendar time mm-hmm. across what would be the x-axis, and then each of these lines represents a child coming into foster care and staying for different periods of time depending on the length right. of the bar.
And so the bar is set up like this right now. The left side of the bar represents when in calendar time the child entered care. And these red bars indicate those children who had not yet exited by the time our study cutoff period had come.
So when you look at the data in this way, which is what this would represent what folks might see if they went to their data system and pulled data and saw children entering care, and with differing lengths of time, there's some you're limited with respect to what you can say about that whole group of
right,
data
exactly.
that you're looking at.
So we spend a lot of time telling folks, look at your entry cohorts. And entry cohort analysis is often or usually the best way to talk about what happened, what is the typical experience of children in your system. So you go to your data set and you pull out an entry cohort, and it looks like that. And then you think,
what can I say about it?
What can I say?
And
wow.
there are a few things you can say about it,
right.
as we were just pointing out or beginning to point out. You can say, for one thing, how many children are in your entry cohort.
Right.
And since we have, you count the lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There's 11 lines, so there are 11 children in the entry cohort. You can tell the amount of time that each of those children spent mm-hmm. in care, depending on the
right.
length here.
Roughly, you can look at it and get a sense that some kids came in early in the year and stayed a long time. Some kids came in early and stayed a shorter time. Kids come in over the course of the year. When they come in does not necessarily have anything to do with their duration. So there's information, but it's not organized.
Right. It's, yeah. Oh, and one other thing that you pointed out before was that if they're still in care at the end of your study cutoff, we don't know if these children will exit on the next day or much further down the line. And that's why we've coded them separately. Right. We're censored, and that's why they're red.
Right. So the idea was give folks this physical representation of an entry cohort and ask them to do something with this information that will enable them to summarize the experience of this group of children in a meaningful way that contributes to their efforts to focus on opportunities for improvement. So
toward that end, then a next step would be to organize this information in a spatial way that seems to make more sense.
Right.
With respect to duration, which would be to go from the sorted, from the shortest
right.
duration to the longest.
So we're going to do that now. I mean, that's basically what we're trying to do with this hands-on exercise is recognize that an entry cohort is counted based on calendar time, but you can pivot from this calendar time view to a duration view when you're trying to figure out something to say about the experience of these kids. So this is what the next step of this exercise would involve. Taking this entry cohort, switching from the calendar perspective and into a duration perspective, and then just sorting these bars by their length. That puts us in the position to be able to offer more summary statements about the experiences of this group of children in this foster care system. So here we go. We're lining them all up because this point represents 0 or 1 day in care, and now they're just in order by the amount of time they spent in care, regardless of when they entered care. So this image represents sort of a full pivot from the calendar view, which is how an entry cohort comes into care, to a duration view, which allows you to much more deftly summarize the experience of children in care with respect to duration.
So now you could begin to make a summary statement about the entire group with respect to duration in care by, for example, looking at the middle point or the median time in care, which is what we encourage folks to do when they're describing length of time in care.
Right. So we want to be able to say something about this group. And one thing that people often want to know is, well, typically, how long does it take for children who are placed in foster care? How long are they in foster care before they exit? So what would we do?
So by looking at the middle point or the middle child, the median time in care would be the point at which the middle child had exited care.
Right.
And as we said before, there were 11 children in this cohort, and so the middle child would be the 6th child. There would be 5 children that exit prior to that middle child, and there would be 5 children after that middle child that had longer durations. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The 6th child would be would be the middle child. Right.
So if folks, having sort of worked with the data in this manner, and if there were, if this was in a spreadsheet, there'd be numbers, and you could summarize by saying, well, it took half the kids in this entry cohort, maybe 14 months to exit care, or less.
If this was 2 years of time, then yes, then that would be roughly 14 months, 13, 14 months.
The second half of kids more than a year to leave care. And that's information. And not only is it a way that creates some order out of this chaos and it represents a good measurement principle, but the thing that we're really trying to enforce is that once you measure something correctly, you still aren't changing an outcome. It's just providing you with critical information that supports good decision making. So now you're in a position to do something with this information.
So now you may want to start asking questions about this, these children that are coming into your system. You may want to focus on one aspect of your the work that you're doing in your system, like, for example, on the front end. Let's say you have a number of very short stayers. This is only 11 children, but if you were in a large jurisdiction, let's say you had a great many of these very short stayers, you may determine that there's some practice changes you want to implement to perhaps not bring those children into care in the first place.
Right.
Maybe do more family maintenance type activities and that sort of thing, which is perfectly reasonable and laudable. And in doing that, you may be successful at that, and you may actually ultimately bring in fewer of the short stayers.
Right. So remembering that what we're trying to do is support the integration of measurement principles and sort of thoughtful action into a CQI cycle, what you would do if you were to develop such an intervention and implement it and it were to be successful, well, you would measure your next entry cohort. And what might you see?
Using your CQI process, circling back to your data and reviewing on an ongoing basis, you would see you were successful, you had fewer children coming in, and now your duration will, for the children that you are bringing in, will have become longer because you've now, those shorter stayers are no longer in your entry cohort, so now you're going to observe that your duration will have lengthened.
Right, and this is really important because first of all, it reinforces our conviction and sort of sense of urgency around continual measurement, but it also underscores, I think in a pretty effective way, that when you do something that's successful and it affects this outcome of duration, if you can explain what you did, why you did it, and that it had the intended effect, then you can also explain why your median duration went up in a way that then supports another set of interventions. So once you have done this, or if you're in a system where this isn't what's required, then what do you do next? And I think that using your data in this manner helps you focus on where you might want to turn your attention and also helps you think about your next set of questions.
And some of those next sets of questions could be around other attributes of these children in your entry cohort that might also be influencing what we're seeing in terms of duration, right, such as age at entry to care. Or
placement type, or information about service need that you might learn from an assessment.
Exactly.
Those things, because again, we rely on our data systems to provide information that will inform decision making, but it also provides information that informs inquiry. And both of those things are necessary so that you can structure your next set of activities. So here, we might now see a system where the median duration has gone up. We have a new focus. We want to understand a little bit more about these kids, their families, what we can do to change the new median duration, and continue to drive good outcomes through solid measurement and good CQI principles. That's why we sort of hit this really hard. It's just an important tool that will help you make good decisions, but it certainly isn't the only thing that you're going to do to improve an outcome is, create a
it's one step
orderly board
in the
of
process.
magnets. Right. Okay, so we weren't able to include the magnet board in our workbook.
We were not, but we have included in your workbook some exercises on duration that do illustrate these principles. So we'd encourage you to go to that part of the workbook and complete those exercises, and we feel that will help you to understand these duration principles in a very clear way.
That's right. So good luck.